right, cool. All right, let's see what's next. Um, all right, so there's this notion of being a data-driven company that's pretty powerful, and it's certainly something that I'm a fan of. Jeff Jarvis goes deep, into this management philosophy in his book. What would Google do? I think I read that book like 10 years ago. Victoria, I'm going to throw this one to you. Can you speak to the value of data in managing team performance and leveraging that in a client relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just having data to back anything up it is always helpful. And I think it kind of brings a tangible component to the conversation. Of course, I can show up to a status review and say the team has been really productive this week. But what does that really mean? So
Right.
putting some data back to it helps us really kind of track what does that mean? We've been really productive that week. That's great. And so we have various data points that is kind of like a shared language where we can understand really what do we mean, or did we increase our productivity or did we decrease our productivity?
Right. Excellent. As a follow-up to that, Jalen, do you have a additional perspective you want to add?
No, I mean, I think, like she said, it's definitely just a great aid to the communication, right? To just remove any ambiguity that may come from differences in perspective. And then I guess if there's anything to add, it's just, sort of more so from the team management perspective. Data just allows you to understand, sort of what you should be doing along the way. It takes the guesswork out of really getting a sense for, how high should our velocity be, or how well we are actually performing within a given sprint. I think, again, the big thing is just it removes ambiguity for me as a manager.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point, Victoria, in terms of like a shared language, a shared understanding, so that there's no confusion, no matter what the conversation is. And Jalen, you just mentioned the term velocity, so I want to talk some about the specifics of Scrum. What is velocity? What does that mean? From a Scrum perspective?
Yeah, so the definition is basically the velocity is the number of story points that our Scrum team was able to achieve in a given sprint. Mm-hmm. Now, to take that a step further, what are story points, right? And what does that even mean? For us, story points are essentially like a degree of difficulty or a weight that we place to each given story requirement feature that we've decided to pull into the given sprint. And so as opposed to maybe saying, okay, at the end of our sprint, we were able to accomplish, 7 stories, we'll say we accomplished 25 story points, right? Because, each story obviously is going to vary in terms of its level of difficulty. So, I think it really just helps us measure how well we were accomplishing what we set out to or estimated at the beginning of the sprint.
Yeah, to continue on that a little bit, Victoria, Jalen talked about story points as it relates to an individual sprint. But over the life of the sprint, what does velocity mean over the life of a sprint? And how does it relate to a team over the life of a sprint? And I guess where I'm going with this is, when a team first comes together, you probably really don't know what that team's velocity is. And if we think about, a marathon, runner or long distance runner, you don't know if that person can average, 20 miles an hour, or that's probably ridiculous. You don't know if they can, average like, 2 miles per hour or 1 mile per hour or whatever the case may be. And so, go into velocity a little bit further and how we use it to sort of like measure team performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, sure, when a team first comes together, it's hard to know what will their output be, what will their velocity be. And of course, we like to calculate an average velocity, and that helps us in planning. So when a team, let's say, has consistently been able to successfully accomplish 30 to 40 story points, then that's a pretty good baseline when planning the next sprint. How much can we commit to? So it's a tool to help the team decide what they can commit to. But also, as we've talked about, we have very short feedback loops within the Scrum process. So not only on the product, but on the process. So I know I touched on the sprint retrospective earlier, but so in the retro, the team is constantly iterating and improving upon their own process. So you'd actually hope to see velocity improve and start going up over the full product development lifecycle. Sprint 1, the team might have a velocity of 30, but hopefully by Sprint 9, they've improved upon their process. They've really gelled together as a team and learned how they can work as efficiently as possible. And hopefully it's gone up, and their average has been increasing slowly as they continue to improve their process and work together.
Yeah. And so just to I guess put a point on that, if this velocity was, at a certain level, call it here, at Sprint 0, and then, by the time Sprint 9 came, the velocity was here, and it was just a steady uptick. At some point, if this, let's just call it like a 50 per sprint, or 50 sprint, I'm sorry if I could speak. It was a 50 sprint engagement. At some point it would stabilize, right? The idea is that,
Sure.
it would flatten out, and that, we could very easily predict how many story points, what the productivity of that team was going to be on a per sprint basis. And that's, again, another powerful Scrum tool. Okay.
Exactly. And it just helps us in planning, when planning the full roadmap for the product and product delivery, it helps us to really gauge where those milestones are, just being able to predict what this team can produce and how quickly.
That's right. And so we didn't go deep into it because we didn't talk financials. But one of the, the product management, responsibilities obviously is to manage a budget and build, a product according to a budget. And the ability to plan, in a precise manner as possible helps to manage the budget, in a precise management or a precise way possible. So that's a very powerful tool, from that perspective. So, speaking of velocity and speaking of user stories and points, Jalen, why don't you walk us through, what is a burn down chart, what it's meant to convey, to a product owner and the rest of the Scrum team, what it conveys to a stakeholder, a client. And then, at the end of that, talk about a burn up chart in the same way.
Yeah, so a burn down chart can measure a couple of things, right? So one, it can be a burn down chart for stories, for tasks, or for bugs even. And essentially what it does is it measures the team's progress throughout the sprint sort of against what our estimated commitment was, right? And so ideally what you want to see when you look at a burn down chart is sort of like this incremental, step down as we, accomplish stories or accomplish tasks, that we pulled into this sprint. Sort of similarly, the burn up chart is meant to convey, again, sort of this similar like gradual increase as we go through the sprint and completion of tasks and stories, but just from a slightly different perspective. But yeah, so that's kind of like in a nutshell, what we use our burn up and burn down charts for.
Yeah. So what that, for the layman, if I might translate, then it seems like the burn down chart is you've got this like mountain of, let's call it like, dirt. And that's your task, is to remove that dirt. And so if you're shoveling that, and moving it somewhere else, like over time, that mountain is going to slightly, diminish and get smaller. And so that's the perspective of looking at your workload as it's this big mountain that you need to, sort of like, or tree or whatever that you need to chop down. Chopping down trees is not green. Let's stick with the moving dirt. You need to move this mountain of dirt, and slowly but surely it flattens out, to the surface when you've got it complete. And you want to see that as smooth as possible over time. Whereas the burn up chart, that's, you need to actually build a mountain, right? That's the perspective of the mountain's not there. And so you need to move some earth, you need to move some dirt, and build a mountain. And again, we would hope that over time, that graph is smooth. So those are good tools for the team to rally around, to understand what their performance looks like. I guess, Victoria, if you're with your team at the end of the sprint, and I know this isn't about retrospectives, but if you were like, to discuss the burn down chart with your team, if your burn down chart looked like, sort of like an elliptical graph, like, what does that indicate to your team, and what might you, coach them on as it relates to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, like these charts are just like really helpful visual representations of how productive a team was. So, noting on what might stand out at the end of a sprint. Sure, like we want to see the burn down chart go down incrementally, because we want to be accomplishing tasks and moving on to the next, accomplishing and moving on to the next. Just having these small chunks of work that we can incrementally complete. So of course, you don't want to see a burn down chart that just looks like a cliff and goes straight down at the very end. It definitely happens sometimes, but that would definitely be a conversation in the retro of how can we start finishing things quicker and just incrementally, rather than spending the 2 weeks having everything in progress. Because it's nice to be able to prioritize the team's focus. Of course, in a sprint, they're working on the current priorities, but even within that sprint, it is nice for someone on the team and the team to be able to rally around a task, finish it, move on to the next, finish it, move on to the next, rather than be working on multiple things at once. So that's why we like to see those steps down.
Very cool. Thanks. Continuing with Victoria.